On a recent trip to photograph the streets of New York City, I made an effort to experiment with Portra 400. I had brought over 40 rolls and I wanted to see what happens if I pushed Portra to 1600 ISO. So at night, my buddy Gable and I walked around Times Square and the surrounding areas to see how it would perform. And at that time of filming, I have never pushed Portra that hard. So before we even started shooting, I wrote a couple of questions down in my notes app to reference for later. Number 1. How will this film respond to push developing? I was always skeptical at how this beautiful color film with soft colors and tones would handle pushing. Typically when you push any color film, you will see added grain and much more contrast. And certain film stocks will respond with weird color shifts, resulting in images that don't reflect accurate color. How will Portra respond to 2 stops of pushing? Will the colors be accurate, or will the images even be usable? Question number 2. Will 1600 ISO be usable in a setting like Times Square? Now, even though Times Square is one of the exceptions where at night the bright signs and billboards make it feel like the daytime, we can't dismiss the fact that it is still night. Certain scenes facing away from all the bright light could easily be dark, and in that case, will 1600 ISO be enough? And lastly, question number 3. Will the results resemble the Portra we know and love? Portra 400 has an iconic look that many of us can easily recognize. But will pushing it bring out any of the characteristics that we know and love? Despite shooting it at 1600 ISO, it is still Portra 400. So I was very curious to see what these images would turn out to be and if they look anything like Portra 400. So after writing these questions, we went out and photographed Times Square. The first thing that I noticed was that I almost shot everything wide open to get a decent shutter speed. Even with all the bright lights at 1600 ISO, the meter in my Leica was telling me to shoot it at f2 1/60th of a second. And folks, this honestly was a struggle, as the fast-paced movement of the people around me made me hesitant to press the shutter. I knew I needed to approach this differently and remain stationary when making a photograph. Well, ladies and gentlemen, despite the challenges thrown our way, I was pleasantly surprised with these images. The photographs somehow turned out great. Well, that is some of them. The colors were definitely more saturated. The grain became very noticeable, which is to be expected with the push, of course. But what surprised me were the colors. Because this is not a cine-based film, none of the lights had that natural halation effect. They remained true to Portra's characteristics. One thing I noticed though was that the images often shifted green. There was like a green color cast that took over a lot of these images. And even after adjusting the tint in post to compensate, there were still remnants of that green color cast living within the photographs. But what surprised me most about pushing Portra to 1600 ISO were the tones. There was still a ton of warmth coming through in these images, especially in those bright lights. And in theory, we are underexposing this film. The colors were still very manageable. And sure, it wasn't ideal, but with a little work, you could easily get away with these color shifts and make some really beautiful images. But of course, upon further inspection, I did find one problem: underexposure. In a lot of the shadow detail areas where the highlights were mostly exposed, you'll start to see the muddy grain that typically comes with underexposure. But because this is pushed to 1600 ISO, it was just severely enhanced. There was almost like a fade effect going on in these shadow areas, especially when you try to adjust the exposure in post. And the only way to make that usable is to either adjust these shadow areas to have more contrast or just to leave it as is. This had to have been the most unpleasant feature of shooting this film at 1600 ISO. Now, to avoid this issue, you would have to expose more for the shadows, but by doing so, you are also going to need an extra stop or 2 of light, and this begs the question, do I need a faster lens like a 1.4 lower, or should I sacrifice my shutter speed and shoot it at 1/15th of a second, in which all of my images would look blurry? This is the biggest trade-off I had to make while shooting it, and it's an issue that you may run into as well. But hey, for a color film that is native 400 ISO being pushed to 1600, I definitely think this is not bad at all. In fact, I would easily do this all over again. The best way I could describe the final look is it looks like Portra pushed 2 stops. I mean, the same characteristics, just more enhanced with deeper color and saturation and maybe some color shift, but at the end of the day, it still looks like Portra just shot at night. But this also makes me wonder, does shooting it at 1600 ISO give off a certain look? Like, is this something that is going to be appealing to the masses and eventually will become an established way of shooting Portra 400. Let me know in the comment section down below and let's get a little conversation started, as I'd love to hear your thoughts. Now, to conclude my experiment of pushing Portra 400 to 1600 ISO, would I recommend doing this? My final answer is absolutely. The results may vary depending on location, but I still think this is a worthwhile approach if you are shooting in low light. Especially if you are in a pinch and you don't have access to a higher ISO color film, shooting Portra at 1600 ISO will still give you really nice usable results, with the exception of running into a grainy mess if underexposed. So make sure to feed it light. But before we go, I want to ask you guys one more thing, and I want you to think long and hard about this one. What do you think this film would look like shot at 3200 ISO? That is a 4-stop push. Well, if you're curious, find out in next week's episode. This has been King Japes. As always, Minolta Gang.